Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. I've gathered you all here today because we do have the FIDE Grand Prix going on. So I appreciate your attendance. Anyways, man, you know what? I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. Something I didn't mention last video I forgot about. I did change my chess legends. So it is the great Jan Timman, who actually played Anatoly Karpov for the championships, the World Championship back in 1993. You guys, any of you guys that are like really super familiar with chess history, you guys know that Garry Kasparov and Nigel Short, they split from FIDE for a period of time in the 90s. And so they pretty much had two different World Championships that they played. Jan Timman, he did play against Anatoly Karpov in the FIDE portion of that. Because as you guys know, they had the Pro Chess Association in that period. But anyways, and interestingly enough, he was actually born in the same year as Anatoly Karpov, my previous chess legend. So I guess I'm just doing a whole bunch of 1951 guys. But anyways, we do have Wesley versus Alexei Shirov in round 3. We do have my people in the Philippines. I would say mabuhay to you. Kamusta na aking mga kaibigan? Magandang umaga, magandang hapon. Depending on when you see this, magandang araw. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. Maraming salamat for watching my stuff. Aking kaibigan or aking makaibigan, all of my people. And so Alexei Shirov does represent Spain. So I would say muchas gracias, mis amigos, para ver mi video. Bienvenidos. Hola, como está? Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. And he is originally from Latvia. So I have only spoken Latvian one time on camera. So let me hit that up. Svieki, I believe is how you say hello. And paldies is how you say thank you. So I appreciate everybody very much for stopping by. And as I always tell people, if you ever want to skip the entire intro, I do put it at the very top of the description. So you can click that and it'll get you exactly to the analysis, which is going to start right now. If you guys are ready to go, let's take a look. I know somebody out there is going to really love this video because it has a very interesting feature. And you're going to know what I'm talking about. But let's roll. So we got C4, C6. Knight to F3, we got D5, and then we have D4. It's a Slav. You know what? Like I said, somebody out there is gonna be like, you know what? It's a freaking Slav, bro. And it is that. It is a Slav. Personally, I actually go knight to C3 in this position. So I won't have the knight here. So I'll have something like this rolling, and then I will play the Slav this way. But, I think that the way that Wesley is playing it is legitimate as well. Seeing as he's like, in the top, I think 5 in the world or 10 or something like that. He's up there. So anyway, it is a Slav defense. We do have knight coming to F6. We have E3. We're just wanting to make sure that we capture this pawn back pretty immediately if it's taken. So the bishop comes to F5. We see just simple development, knight to C3. We got E6, knight coming to H4. This is a very common theme in the Slav or like a semi-Slav type situation because his bishop, it also is something in the Caro-Kann, not as much, but it definitely can be something because once you have moved this bishop outside of the pawn chain, it's kind of stuck usually on these 3 squares. And since this knight has moved, there's not really a chance to really kind of trade it off for something. So it's a normal thing to try to harass the bishop. So we do see the bishop moving around a little bit. So the bishop comes to E4. We see F3, and then the bishop goes back to G6. We see bishop down to D2. We got pawn taking C4, pawn taking C4. We got B5, inconveniencing white's bishop now. The bishop coming back to B3, and then we do have bishop to D3. And I mean, this can be a little bit annoying. Sometimes in a semi-Slav, I might do this myself. Like I'll put the bishop up here to D6. And you're just trying to make it hard for white to castle in this position. Because as you guys know, the rules of castling, this square is attacked by a black piece. So the king cannot pass through this square on the route to castling. So for the moment, white is stuck and they are not able to castle. So we do see bishop down to C1. And, we're asking the black bishop, what does it want to do? Because you're kind of off sides, bro. So the bishop does come back to c4. We got bishop taking c4, pawn taking c4. And it might look kind of bad in this position for black because you're thinking like, man, you know, they got double pawns here and stuff like that, right? Well, we do see g3 by white. And we have actually reached the point in the game that if you do want to pause the video and see what black plays in this position here, go ahead and do so. Okay, cool. So for any of you guys that play like a Slav or semi-Slav or any type of a similar structure or like a Caracan or a French or anything like that, you guys do understand that c5 is a very thematic move. So I think that pretty much any of all of you players out there would recognize this. But if you happen to guess the move c5, you would be absolutely correct. You know, you always want to look at your position and see if you have any weaknesses and then see if you can get rid of those weaknesses. So that is exactly what Alexei Shirov does in this game. At this position, he says, hey, man, I got these double ugly pawns. You know, I need to get more developed. I need to get more free. So let me push c5. You're also trying to, you know, do a little bit of damage to white structure because if you can cause, you know, a lot of trades to happen here, you can strap white with an isolated pawn while getting rid of your own weak pawns. So white is not trying to do that. So we actually see queen to a4 with check. The knight b comes to d7. We see queen taking c4, pawn taking d4, queen taking d4. So as you guys can see, you know, black has managed to get rid of their two bad pawns. And white has managed to make sure their structure is intact and they are actually up a pawn at this point. So we will see if that becomes relevant at some point later on. The bishop comes to c5, gaining a tempo on the queen. Queen goes over to c4. The rook comes over to c8. We have the white queen in the middle of the board, and we don't have a lot of development for white's side. So, you know, you always want to try to gain tempi on a very powerful piece. And that is one of the main reasons that you do not bring your queen out early in the game, because you literally can just get it attacked like this. Now, white did win a pawn, so there is a little bit of justification for, you know, losing a couple tempi. But sometimes, you know, you don't have that justification, so be careful. The queen comes back to e2, a pretty safe square. The knight comes down to e5. We do have castles by white now. The queen comes down to d3. And, you know, you can see that black is almost castled, but, you know, you're trying to pick on this weak point for white. You know, you do have the ability of, you know, swinging the knight over to c4 possibly because this pawn is actually pinned to the king. So you got to be kind of careful that you don't let black, you know, grab their pawn back. So we do see queen taking d3, knight taking d3. The knight comes down to g2, just adding protection onto this pawn, because after knight takes c1 and rook takes c1, it is definitely capturable with, you know, with gusto. So the king comes to e7. We see rook over to d1, rook h to d8. And you guys might be wondering in this position, like, why did he do this instead of just castling? Well, the queens are off the board. So whenever you do have queens off of the board, the position, the board becomes a lot safer for the kings to start making their way to the center of the board. There are a lot less tactics. As you guys are familiar, there are crazy amounts of tactics when you do have queens still on the board. So there is a big difference here. So, but like I said, we do have rook h to d8. The king comes over to f1. We got bishop down to b4. Knight comes down to e2. We see knight back up to e5. Knight takes d8, or rook takes d8, rook takes d8. We see knight to d4. Bishop coming to c5. We see knight down to b3. And I mean, stuff has started to kind of shift in white's favor. You know, white is actually starting to put a little bit of an attack on black, you know, gain a couple tempi, you know, because this bishop at the moment is undefended. So now it's needing to be moved. So the bishop does come back to b6. And we do see king up to e2. You know, like I said, I mean, white is just up a pawn. You know, they're not really in any danger. There's not like any tactics or anything involved in what's going on. So, I mean, they're just looking pretty good. So the knight comes down to d5. We see e4. We have knight over to b4. And I mean, this is a little bit tricky because we are slightly underdeveloped for white. So, you know, we kind of have to get something rolling. So the bishop comes up to d2. We see a5. And, you know, black's intention is to try to push this pawn down here and inconvenience this knight. You know, we have like some pretty good control as black. So if we can knock this knight out of the way, the knight doesn't really have any good squares to go to. So you really don't want to like underdevelop, you know, like move the knight back onto the first rank. So the bishop comes up to c3. We see knight over to c4. We got a4 just preventing, b4 from coming from black. We see knight down to d3. We got rook over to b1. We have quite a heavy attack going on the b2 point for black. So we do have f6. The knight comes down to e1. We really kind of want to get this knight out of here because it's a little annoying. So the knight d comes back to e5. We see rook over to c1 because, ideally you want to put it on one of these open files as a rook. So we do see, we got g5, f4, pawn takes f4, pawn takes f4, and then we see knight up to g6. We see knight up to d3. So as you can see, white is starting to kind of get their pieces unraveled a little bit. And, their advantage has grown just a little bit. One of the things about, having an extra piece of material, whether that's a whole piece or an entire pawn, as you trade further down, your advantage grows a lot higher, just because basically if you trade everything down, you're just going to have an extra piece and you should be able to get into a winning type of endgame. The bishop comes down to e3, putting a little tickle on that rook. The rook slides over to f1. We have bishop back to b6. We got f5, pawn takes f5, rook takes f5, and then we do have a rook down to d6. We got rook to h5. And white is making it pretty hard for black. They're putting a lot of nice attacks on squares. They're currently up a pawn, but as you guys can see, this pawn is probably, going to be dropping at some point because, there just really is not a good way to defend it. We do see rook over to e6. We see rook up to h7 with check. King goes to d6. We see king up to f3. We got king to c6. We see knight to f4. And you're going to have to trade here because, you're placing an attack on two undefended pieces. And one of them is a rook. So you're kind of forced to do it. Rook, knight takes f4. King takes f4. You see rook over to d6. Rook over to f7, attacking yet another pawn. The knight comes over to e5. We see rook over to g7. Rook comes to d1. We see knight taking a5 with check. And we do see king over to d6, and then we see bishop to b4. And it is in this position that Alexei Shirov does resign the game, and Wesley So has won this one. And you guys might possibly be thinking in this position, why does black resign? The pieces are equal. Yeah, you are losing a lot of pawns, but isn't there kind of some type of way to get out of it? Well, the answer is no. Basically, there is a super quick checkmate, or you're pretty much going to have to lose a piece because there are only two moves in this position. One move is actually king to e6, which allows an immediate mate on e7 with the rook. So we definitely can't do that. And then you also have the ability to block with bishop to c5. But unfortunately, this fails because you're going to be looking at knight to b7 with check. And then the king is going to move over to c6. The knight's going to take on c5. And you just don't have, these pawns are doing a beautiful job of keeping the king, away from, trying to, creep closer to this, this bishop. After the rook would come over and check on f1, king would go to e3. You're thinking maybe you're going to grab a little pawn or something real quick, but unfortunately you're going to see king to e2. And now you have your rook attacked. So you're not able to do what you want to do. And you are just down an entire piece and 3 pawns. So it is, very understandable why Alexei Shirov would, resign this game. So that is that game. I appreciate everybody stopping by from the Philippines or from Latvia or from Spain. I will say, let me see what I want to say. Mabuting pagbati ingat lagi to anybody that is coming from the Philippines. I will say muchas gracias, mis amigos from Spain. Hasta luego. Buenas noches. But yeah, it might be looking morning there. So buenos dias if it's in the morning to you. And Paldis for anybody coming from Latvia. And I will see you guys next time.